Well, good morning from St Barts in Midtown Manhattan. Welcome to those of you who are here joining us in the room and those of you who are joining us online. This is the forum where each week we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. And the thing that matters this morning is our own church and the ways in which it's changing. And we are very honored to have with us our very own Mary Kate Wold, who's the CEO and president of the Church Pension Group. And as I said at the 9 o'clock service, that makes you very popular with clergy for securing our retirement. Mary Kate not only serves the larger church in this way, but she has lots of history here at St Barts and is a former chancellor of the parish. Thanks so much for being here in person and talking with us today, Mary Kate.
Well, thank you, Peter, and I'm just so thrilled to be here. I think I was here 5 or 6 years ago, kind of a similar conversation, and Peter knows we have a lot of information at the Church Pension Fund and asked me to share what I could about what we're seeing about the changing church. And I thought I would start because not everybody knows who the Church Pension Fund is. Even though I spent 8 years on the St. Barts vestry, I really didn't know who the Church Pension Fund was. And so I thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about what we actually do. And some of you, if you don't know us, you may say, well, why do we care? And the answer would be that a lot of money from St. Barts comes to us every month and every year. So I'd like to hopefully give you confidence that we're spending it well on serving St. Bartholomew's and other churches. So the Church Pension Fund was founded in 1917. We opened our doors, and a bishop, William Lawrence from Massachusetts, from a very prominent wealthy family, had this audacious dream that clergy would no longer retire into abject poverty or die in the pulpit because they couldn't afford to retire, and that there would be this mandatory pension fund for clergy or program for clergy. So he lassoed some of his financier friends in New York, J.P. Morgan, and a few other people who joined the throng to help him raise money for the Church Pension Fund, and they aimed to raise $5 million to start the Church Pension Fund. And ultimately, through the generosity of over 40,000 Episcopalians across the country, they opened their doors with $8.5 million to start paying pensions to clergy. And today, as of March 31st, the Church Pension Fund was at about $19 billion. Given the markets, it's significantly less than that now, but we'll come back. And we've probably spent about $7 billion in benefits over the past 100 years. So we've been doing a lot of good. And we are very intentional about what our role is in the church and how we go about our business. So I've been with the pension fund for 11 years. So shortly after I came, I took my executive team through an exercise. We used Patrick Lencioni. I don't know if any of you know him, but he's kind of a leadership guru and such. He's Catholic, but works with a lot of churches and companies and such, and has a framework for thinking about strategic planning and strategic thinking for an organization. And so we set out to define our mission, and Patrick Lencioni's view was that mission statements for organizations had become kind of wordsmithed rubbish, and basically said, stay away from calling anything a mission statement because it's just going to be gobbledygook. So he talks about purpose. So we defined our highest level purpose for existing and defined that as supporting the clergy and lay employees of the church in their mission to spread the gospel. So we're there as a support structure for the clergy and lay employees. And we do that through 3 areas of business. First of all, our core is employee benefits. Of course, we started with pensions. But now a pension package for a clergy person is multifaceted. We include life insurance, we include retiree medical and disability and other features, a 13th check at Christmas, moving benefit when clergy retire, so a lot of bells and whistles to have a complete package for clergy. And since we've also gone into providing pensions for lay employees. In fact, in 2009, the General Convention made it mandatory for the church, for lay employees to be covered who work at least half time, to be covered by pensions by the Church Pension Fund. And then health benefits, although through the pension fund we provide retiree benefits for retiree medical for clergy, in 2009 the church also decided that we should be the mandatory go-to for health benefits for all clergy and lay employees. And the theory was that by bringing all of the church together, we'd have enhanced buying power, a better risk pool for our participants, and be able to drive down medical costs. Now that's a very frustrating thing to do because, as you know, healthcare is extremely expensive. We have been successful in the 10 plus years that we've been doing this to bring down the cost of medical care for clergy and lay employees to kind of undercut the market by 7 to 10% in cost, providing a much superior and much more compassionate product and service. However, it still is, very angst providing for churches because the sheer cost of healthcare is of course very, very high. And then there are two other businesses that you'd say, what are they doing under the umbrella of a pension fund? But in 1918, we were given something called the Church Hymnal Corporation. And at that time, publishing was a cash cow. So the thought was by giving the Hymnal Corporation to the pension fund, we'd be generating lots and lots of money for them, which in fact was true for a long time. It's now morphed into church publishing, and we publish the Book of Common Prayer as well as the hymnal and other liturgical materials, lectionary inserts and such, and then a plethora of books, and have authors like Stephanie Spellers and others who write for us. But it's a very difficult business and definitely not a cash cow. We struggle to keep our head above water, but I think we still provide a useful service for the church. And then the other line of business is property and casualty. And here again, we're kind of a unique organization because we solely serve the Episcopal Church. And that's a very challenging property and casualty client because, as you might imagine, most of our churches are around the kind of rim of the country. So, hot in the middle of hurricane country and earthquakes, and it's a lot of the churches we insure cannot get insurance anywhere else. And of course, we have a lot of churches like St Barts that are ornate and filled with incredible art and windows and everything. So that's a very unique business. And again, we have to remain self-sufficient, and we've still managed to provide a very affordable and, again, very compassionate, because we're here really to pay claims and make sure we can get churches up and running and such when they face some catastrophe. So our vision, looking at our core, is that we're going to provide our clients with the highest level of financial security when they retire that we can, but with some tension. It has to be financially responsible for us. We have to be able to make it sustainable. And also, we have to be mindful of the evolving needs of the church. So we try not to sit in an ivory tower and just kind of surmise what we think the church needs, but I'm out around the church all the time talking to people, as are my colleagues, trying to figure out what does the church really need, what can the church afford, and that will bring us more to the topic I'll have today, which is what are trends in the church. And starting with this, just looking at the number of people we serve, almost 23,000 clergy, 18,000 active, and about not quite 5,000, lay, sorry, got the wrong, starting out with lay. This is an interesting slide because you'll see these days of active participants, more than 3 times the number of lay than clergy, which that ratio has changed dramatically over the years. So by now, predominantly our participants are lay employees of the church. And then, as you're seeing, we have many more active lay employees than retired, and it's the flip for clergy. We have many more retired clergy than we have active clergy. And we serve over 10,000 institutions. So it's not just churches, it's also dioceses and schools and hospitals and nursing homes. And so quite a variety of clients. So, and as Peter said, a strong connection with St Bartholomew's. I started coming to St Barts in 1978, and my two predecessors, there have only been 7 CEOs of the Church Pension Fund in the well over 100 years that we've been in existence, and 3 of those 7, the last 3, have actually been members of St Bartholomew's. So first, Ellen Blanchard, and Ellen and I served on the St Barts vestry together for many years, and then Dennis Sullivan, and then I. In fact, when I called Bill Tully to say, Bill, they're interviewing me for the CEO of the Church Pension Fund, he said, you'd be great, but you're a member of St. Barts. I'm sure they're not going to go for a 3rd one in a row, but they did, much to my delight. So to go into what we're seeing around the church, so we are just in a position where we get a lot of information about the church, and part of that is that every general convention, the church appoints something that's called a recorder of ordinations, that is, has the responsibility of keeping track of ordinations, people being received into ministry in the church, transfers from one diocese to another, removals, deaths. And every year for decades, we have been assigned that role because we're kind of uniquely situated to gather that information, and it's a little bit expensive to do as well. So we got all of that information, and then at General Convention in 2018, we were asked to collect additional information, and that was on race, ethnicity, gender identity, and sexual orientation, information that nobody in the church was formally collecting in the past, and I'll say a little bit more about that. And then just in our role as administering benefits, we get a host of information: age, gender, compensation, who are people's dependents, and such. So anyway, a lot of rich data. And of course, we use a lot of that in our business, but we also try to package it and make it meaningful in the way that it provides kind of themes and trends and such, and makes it useful for the church as various decisions are made at General Convention and otherwise. So one thing that I don't need to tell us is that the financial challenges in the church are real. And here I'm using some information from the parochial report as well. The latest one is 2020. Churches all provide a lot of information to the church center at 815 2nd Avenue, and they put together parochial reports. So some of what I'll talk to you today combines our data with their data. So first of all, plate and pledge income has been down. There was an over 4% decline in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic. We don't have the more recent information, but it had been fairly stable for a while, but that was quite a large decline. And not surprising given that everybody was locked down and remote at that point in time. We at the pension fund have a legacy fund that was just donations that were given. This doesn't happen anymore, but way back when widows would give their estates to the pension fund to help build up the pension and that, I think now people figure we have a lot of money and people don't need to leave their estates to the pension fund. But back then they did. So we have that in kind of a pool of money that we can use to assist clergy. So we had a program during COVID that said for the really struggling churches that can't pay their bills and that are threatened with going under during COVID, we will waive the pension assessment and pay it out of this special fund. So there were actually fewer than I expected. We could have covered more, but there were about 1,300 waiver requests from around the country, and that totaled about $2.5 million. So actually not as much as we would have expected, and we tried to communicate it again and again that this was available. We talked to bishops to get their assistance in making this fund known. But part of the story may be that people were just trying to, reach deep in their pockets and keep their churches afloat during the pandemic. During the pandemic, churches started even more aggressively pursuing alternative sources of income. And unlike St. Barts, a lot of churches did extremely well in this regard. Preschools stayed open in many areas of the country. They ramped up soup kitchens, daycare centers, and thrift stores. All of those were kind of reinvigorated, and some kept going during the pandemic. So some churches didn't really suffer that decline in other non-plate and pledge revenue. And then, of course, now churches are all plagued with endowments and the fact that we're undergoing this, this tremendous volatility in the markets. But then other churches, back to the point of other revenues, churches like St Barts, where churches had to close and relied on a lot of rental income, and that really did suffer tremendously. Even though parishioners were incredibly loyal and generous, there was still just a large chunk of income that was not going to be available. So when I arrived at the pension fund in 2011, although this trend had already started, the lore was that ordinations and retirements were about the same. So for every priest that retired, a new one was being ordained. And that has quickly diverged. And now you see that the ordinations are only about half the number of the retirements. So we're putting out fewer and fewer clergy. And I had a conversation with somebody just last week who is working with a deployment officer both in Europe and in Vermont, so two very different places, but saying in some areas of the country, in one particular area, there are 100 openings and only 20 applicants for 100 openings in churches. What I also hear is a lot of clergy coming out of seminary can't find jobs and are very disappointed that they can't find a full-time job. But it seems like, as in many industries around the country, people aren't in the places where the jobs are available or don't want to go to the places where the jobs are available. So there's this mismatch, needs in some areas of the country, some sizes of churches, and then ordinands who are looking for a different experience than what is out there. So you're seeing this trend. And right here you see retirements of clergy coming down a bit, dipping in 2021. We think that that's a temporary sort of change because a lot of, and this is kind of lore again, but a lot of what we're hearing is that clergy who might have retired during the pandemic didn't do so for multiple reasons. Some not wanting to abandon their parishes in the middle of a crisis, others just feeling kind of uncertainty and maybe being concerned about their finances a bit and not wanting to retire until they had a clearer picture of what life was going to look like. So we're not expecting that little downward trend that you see in 2021 is going to be the current. We're actually seeing, either kind of leveling or, again, a higher level of retirements going forward, which means fewer and fewer, net fewer priests, and that difference between the number of ordained priests and number of retired priests is just that gap is going to grow. So I mentioned that we were asked by the General Convention, keep my eye on the time. I mentioned that we were asked by the General Convention in 2018 to collect all this data on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and gender identity and such. And that is information we didn't collect before. And people will say, well, why didn't you collect that information before? And the fact of the matter is we didn't collect it because it wasn't relevant to making an actuarial analysis about pensions and that. It just wasn't needed in our business. It wasn't relevant to determining what somebody's longevity would be and when they would collect a pension and that sort of thing. So it wasn't core to what we did. And we were also very loath to kind of collect information for people and violate their privacy when it isn't actually necessary for us. But when we were asked by the church to do this, we were really delighted to be asked. And we've been aggressively going out and trying to collect all this data. The fact of the matter is we're only getting about 20 or 30% response ratio. So I can't tell you. We think that the amount, the 20 or 30%, is still indicative of trends, but it could be if we got a much more fulsome response to all the surveys and data collection efforts we have that you'd see slightly different numbers than I'm going to show you. So here by race and ethnicity. So you'll see about 87% of our priests are white. And, actually a very relatively small number are non-white. And then you get to deacons and you see much more diversity amongst the deacon population. And even when it comes to, to bishops, you see much more diversity among the ranks of bishops than you do on clergy. And there's kind of a saying around that it's a lot easier if you're a person of color to become a bishop than it is to become a rector of a large parish. And the data seems to be bearing that out. And there's a question. Well, why is that? Why are parishes more reluctant to put their bet on a rector of color than dioceses are to elect a bishop? And I don't know what the answer is to that. But it's definitely a trend, and there's a statistical significance to these numbers. So be interested to hear what people might think about that. So sexual orientation, it's kind of a flip. More diversity in terms of sexual orientation when it comes to clergy than deacons and bishops, significantly more. So, there's another question. Why is that? We don't get the whys when we get this data. So, and then gender identity. Here's how we come out in terms of male versus female clergy and non-binary, etc. Very few who are willing to declare. And I've had a number of listening events with the transgender community, and they very much feel themselves to be very much kind of maligned in the Episcopal Church. Not a lot of opportunity for them in that. So I'm really trying to hear their voices and understand their issues. And we've just recently issued a report to the last General Convention where we looked at kind of all of this demographical diversity and then overlaid I must have done 50 listening events around the country with different, whether it was lay employees or people of color, Hispanic and Black and Indigenous and such, and we put all that in the report to kind of overlay the statistics we were seeing in the church with the stories we were also hearing. So they're anecdotal, but interestingly enough, the anecdotes we were hearing very much supported the data that we were seeing as well. So this is a group that I think is larger than we would expect, but even recruiting the transgender community for a conversation, a private conversation with me was difficult to do. But it's an increasing number. So deployment today, I would flip the order of this screen and really talk about the traditional model first. I mean, this is what we're all familiar with here at St Bartholomew's. Clergy who are full-time employed by St Barts at a single employer. Most of our clergy, I don't think, are doing, kind of darting out of here and going to do another service somewhere else in the city in the afternoon. Not that model. Kind of solely working for St Bartholomew, solely working within tech, also not trying to cover a Methodist church down the street, for instance. Are probably employed, may go from St. Barts to somewhere else or come from somewhere else to St. Barts, but probably don't have a lot of interruption in their employment. These are clergy who go predictably from one job to another. And then our clergy gradually see their compensation increasing. It doesn't go down, they don't take haircuts, we hope, and such. So that's the traditional model, and one that I would say, even though St. Barts is changing, we still have the luxury of being in largely that traditional model. But the emerging model in the church is not that. Many more clergy are in part-time employment, whether they want to be or not. Some are bivocational and want to, have a foot in a different career, and as well as being a priest. And I've talked to many of those who are who sought to do that, who are really happy. They might be a lawyer or a prison guard or, a social worker or whatever, and then also a priest, and combine those two careers and find that very satisfying. On the other hand, I've talked to a lot of part-time priests who are just, as I said earlier, very disappointed that they can't find a full-time position and have to put up with a part-time position. And then, of course, there's a lot of economics around that. A lot of churches simply can't afford full-time clergy, and that is a growing rapidly growing phenomenon in the Episcopal Church and in other denominations as well. And that means some of these part-time clergy become the circuit rioters and might work at 2 or 3 different parishes. They have, as I said, work outside of tech. They may have interrupted service, which means that they're in the pension fund, but then they have a gap where they can't find another church job for a few years and then kind of come back in, which obviously gives us some issues in terms of providing a robust pension to them as well. And nonlinear compensation patterns. People can't count on the fact that their compensation is going to increase from one year to the other, so it makes for a much more unpredictable lifestyle for these clergy, and just having to trust their call, I guess, that they're in the right place at the right time. So a little more about this emerging model. This is statistically significant. Male clergy tend to have more full-time positions than female clergy proportionately. So more females are in this emerging market. Clergy of color also, you find more white clergy full-time than clergy of color, but here actually I'm kind of surprised that the gap isn't larger here. And that may be because, as I said before, we're just not getting, a large response rate, though Matthew Price, who's the head of my research team, tells me that this should be fairly indicative of the trend. But the other thing I'm hearing about clergy of color is, even though they may have full-time roles, compared to white clergy in full-time roles, the clergy of color are working in smaller, less resourced churches for significantly lower compensation. So that's the difference there, even though the difference between full-time positions is not that significant. And then you have the LGBTQ population, and again, there's a little bit difference here in terms of full-time and between the two groups, but again, it's not as significant. But I've also had several conversations in these listening events with clergy, LGBTQ clergy, who also talk about having to settle for smaller churches and places they would prefer not to go and such. So again, there is this difference in kind of working for a church like St Bartholomew's for some people. And then here we're back to the traditional model, the senior rector, 77% male and 23% female. So this is pretty dramatic, given that it's almost 50-50 female and male clergy. So women clearly struggle in the Episcopal Church to become rectors of churches the size of St Bartholomew's. And I go to the Women Rector Forum at SEEP, now called the Episcopal Network, I guess, and I hear an earful of this from the women clergy at that event. But this is a pretty dramatic statistic. And then, even more dramatic again when you're looking at clergy of color versus white clergy. And again, it's much easier for a priest who's a person of color to become a bishop than to become a rector in a church like St Bartholomew's. And then same when it comes to the LGBTQ community. So, and then just something about the non-parochial. So here I'm talking about people who are not acting as priests in a parish. So it could be diocesan office staff, it could be teachers, it could be hospital workers. There's one school. In the South, there are a lot of schools that have a large number of teachers who are in our lay pension funds. Not as common here in the North, but it's it's almost 50-50, but more predominantly male than female, even in the non-parochial model. But more in line. And then here you see it on an ethnic basis, more white clergy than clergy of color. And the LGBTQ versus heterosexual. So then just a little bit about churches like St Barts. So we spend a lot of time gathering data and talking about the plight of smaller parishes, and going from full-time clergy and maybe even a full-time clergy and an assistant or whatever to barely being able to afford part-time clergy. And so a lot of statistics on that. So it was like pulling teeth to get my head of research to talk about, well, give me statistics on the large parishes, though. So because we don't spend a lot of time, as much time as a church, and I'm not talking about the pension fund, but as a church, kind of talking about the plight of larger parishes. So let me say a little bit about churches like St. Barts. First of all, we're in a very kind of elite number of the Episcopal Church. So total number of parishes, and this has come down dramatically since I started. This number was well over 7,000 churches 11 years ago when I started the pension fund. So we're seeing churches closing, significant number of churches closing every year, and they're obviously not the St. Barts of the world. In terms of resource-sized parishes, which is defined as average attendance of over 400, there are only less than 2% of the churches in the country who meet that definition. And in terms of congregations with multiple active clergy, less than 10% of churches in the country are able to afford more than one priest. In terms of churches with total revenue between $1 million and $2.5 million, it's only about 5%, and then when you look at churches that have revenue of over $2.5 million, under 1.5%. So as you can see, St. Barts is in a very unique club in the Episcopal Church. And I was having this conversation with Manny before we got started, and this is a conversation I'm hearing frequently, that the future of the Episcopal Church may be lots of small churches closing and people flocking to the larger churches, that the larger churches become kind of more the model for the Episcopal Church. But the flip side of that is I'm hearing churches being done in different ways. That churches may be home churches, or churches may be meeting in laundromats, as they do in some places in California, and just kind of different ways of thinking about church. And that, of course, that thinking has been challenged, I think, during the pandemic, where people have become a lot more creative, thinking about what does it mean to be a member of a church. So one thing that, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but one thing that I think is interesting is the larger the church is, the less it relies on plate and pledge for revenue. And I talked about this before. This just shows with a larger church there are more opportunities to use facilities and such, and have other sources of income. So you see that here, but it also means it's perhaps a lot less reliable, as we learned during the pandemic when we had to close St. Barts, and there went a lot of rental income. So just kind of some thoughts on leadership challenges for large parishes. I think it's going to be, as we already know, and I've been virtual for many Sundays now, as I was saying to Peter, it's harder to count what is average worship attendance when you have people attending at different times during the week, people attending virtually? How do you define a resource parish, or these other categories that we like to put churches in, and that are kind of standard way about talking about churches in the Episcopal Church? So one thought is that maybe a resource parish is better to look at resource by looking at resources in terms of financial resources, as opposed to who's actually in the pews on Sunday mornings. And then, of course, larger parishes, as I said, are more reliant on this revenue beyond plate and pledge. So having to think creatively about where do we get that additional revenue. Some churches rent out parking lots. Obviously, that's not an urban church like, say, or a New York City church, at least, like St Bartholomew's. And also, it's interesting that our churches employ the bulk of lay employees in the United States. So a lot of smaller churches have volunteers instead of lay employees. So that's a larger tribe to support, and financially and otherwise. And then I hear a lot from small churches about rectors coming out of seminaries, priests coming out of seminary, going to small churches, needing to know everything from how to unclog a toilet to community organizing, because they have to be kind of everything. And then the issue, I think, for rectors of large churches like St Bartholomew's is they're really like a CEO. I mean, they're incredible, financial kind of resources and issues to oversee, lots of people to oversee, management issues and such. So just preparing our rectors, whether they're for small churches or large churches like St Bartholomew's, is a challenge. And there are a lot of organizations in the church now who are looking at how do we help clergy develop that broader range of skill set that's not just, preparing the sermons and making pastoral calls, but how do they deal with the fact that they're called upon to have multiple professions under one hat, basically. So that's all I have in terms of trends today, but I'd be happy to answer any questions. Lots of numbers I threw at you, but I think the trends are quite interesting.
Thank you so much, Mary Kate. Super, super helpful. We have a few minutes for questions, so if you have them, if you're in the room, Manny Rodriguez-Leach has some cards on the center table. You can grab a card and fill out a question and hand it to him. If you're joining us online, you can fill out a question on the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org, pthompson@stbarts.org. Mary Kate, you were very active in the church before you took on this role. I'm wondering, what was your biggest surprise when you stepped into the CEO seat about how the church worked? You thought you knew how it worked, and how did it look different from that vantage
That
point?
is a very easy, I didn't know you were going to ask that, but that's a really easy question to answer. I was on the St Barts vestry. I was on the vestry of my little church up in the country, very active in the church my entire adult life. I felt this was a call to come to the pension fund and lead this. I had no idea what church politics was like. National church politics, general convention, I was flabbergasted. That was the biggest surprise. It seemed very removed from life in a parish and from kind of what my vision of what the church was should be. But I play in that pond a lot, so. Yeah,
you've become very familiar with that, with those skills. Parishes have to pay into the pension fund quite a bit, as you've noted, and clergy get benefits that are stronger than a lot of people in the pews get from their employers. To what extent do you get pushback from parishes of why do we have to pay this much into the pension fund, and what's your rationale for why it's so important to support clergy?
So the assessment is 18% of clergy compensation, and that covers that whole basket of benefits I showed you, from disability to life insurance and retiree medical and such, for that 18%. And we do get pushback from some parishes. We can't afford 18%. We get some priests saying it's kind of embarrassing that I have these wonderful benefits and a lot of people in my congregation do not. We would never say never. We have the ability unilaterally to adjust the assessment. It would be highly unlikely that we would ever do that without a strong signal from General Convention. It's been at the 18% since the 70s or so, and had gradually worked its way up to 18%. But it's interesting because there was I feel good about it, incidentally, because clergy, if you think of it in terms of the level of education and such that clergy have and the investment that they've made, and the lifestyle that they have, they have the equivalent of what you'd have as a lawyer or a doctor or many other professions, and actually make, relatively little during their career. So the fact that they can actually, and I showed you a quote from Bishop Lawrence, that they can actually not worry about retirement and be able to not have that anxiety, but be able to go about ministering while we worry about how to support them in retirement. I feel really, really good about that. But one interesting thing is that there was a proposed resolution at the last General Convention that did not pass, but someone was proposing that the assessment be reduced from 18% to 15% to enable small parishes to be able to afford a priest. But when you think about that, lowering it's 18% of compensation. So compensation is the 100% of compensation plus 18%. If you brought it down by 3%, that's like reducing the entire compensation package by about 1.5% or 2%. So that really, it seemed like a magic bullet to some people that would make a big difference. But reducing, the package that you'd pay to a priest to come to your parish by 2% is obviously not going to make or break whether you can afford a priest. So there is a little bit of this lore that the assessment is so high, and that's the reason that we can't be financially strong in our parish. But when you look at it overall, it's unfortunately kind of reducing the assessment is not the magic bullet that some would look to. But we're willing to, if the church said we want you to bring it down to 15% or 12%, we would work with that. It may be that we would have to adjust the benefits that we pay. We go through, a very in-depth financial assessment as to what could be affordable and sustainable, because we have to be here. I tell people, if somebody is ordained at 28 or 30 years old, they're looking to us for the next 70 years potentially. So we have to make sure that whatever we do is going to be sustainable for many, many decades into the future.
Question about deacons. They're not always compensated, or
Right.
not compensated at the same level. How does the pension fund cover deacons, and do you cover volunteers at all?
We do not cover volunteers. I don't think there's anywhere in any industry where people get a pension for volunteering. So, so we don't do that either. You have to pay into the fund for us to pay you. Though the interesting thing is, we pay out in benefits over 4 times the amount of assessments we get in every year. And how are we able to do that? We're able to do that because we keep a nice cushion of assets, less over the last few months, but a nice cushion of assets, and we have a really crack investment team who are at the top of their game and are able to invest very, very well. So it's the earnings on the portfolio that allows us to be able to close that gap, which is a huge gap. We pay out over $400 million in benefits, and we get in less than $100 million of assessments every year. And I'm sorry, what was the question?
Deacons.
Oh, deacons, yes. So volunteers, no, we don't cover volunteers. We changed the pension fund in 2018 to make it easier for people at the very lowest income levels to participate in the fund. So a deacon, if they otherwise meet our definition of employment, which means a certain level of continuity and regularity and such, and it's all spelled out in the pension fund, they have to be kind of considered an employee of the church, but a minimum amount. And some dioceses are decreeing that deacons have to be paid $25 a month so that they can be compensated and therefore get into the pension fund. So that would yield a very tiny pension, of course, if you're only getting paid $25 a month, because the pension keys off compensation, but allows them to participate in many other programs we have, like something called Credo, which is a retreat, and a lot of benefits that in addition to just the pension. So it is possible, and we meet many times annually with groups of deacons to let them to make sure that they're aware of this and to help them advocate for themselves.
Question about clergy housing and any role you have in that. Obviously, clergy, when they retire, are in the unique situation of many of them don't have a home because they're losing their home as because it was provided as part of their compensation. So kind of what happens to a clergy person when they retire and their housing, and do you have any role in that?
Well, the only real role we have in that, I mean, obviously we hope that their pension will help defray some of that cost, but we also have something called we've changed the name multiple times, but it's about $20,000 or $25,000 that is to help them move. So it's intended to kind of help them with moving costs and that as they go into a new home. We obviously don't pay for a new home, but we've got lots of stories on our websites of clergy who have found that their pension have actually enabled them to do more than they thought they'd be able to afford, and have been, kind of pleasantly surprised at what they've been able to do.
A follow-up question on racial trends. Do you know anything about how those trends have changed over time? And the 4% of black priests we have now, has that been a lower number or higher in the past?
Yeah, I don't, because this is the first time we've collected that data. So I really don't know. I mean, hopefully the number's increasing, but I don't know.
From your kind of lofty perch where you're looking at the whole church, what wisdom do you have for leaders of St. Barts as we embark on this next phase?
Oh, what a good question. Keep up that non-blatant pledge revenue. But, I do, nothing from my lofty perch. I'm just so encouraged by what I saw during the pandemic and the number of people. I mean, I'm if I'm not here in person, then I'm, definitely online. And it's been great to see the growth of the online community. And I hate to hear churches talk about, well, we could get that person from that church and bring them over here. I don't think we should be in the business of trying to, kind of disengage people from one Episcopal Church or even another denomination and bring them here. But I think in the pandemic, we either brought back people or attracted people who are unchurched and curious, where it was not threatening to go online and explore church as to kind of walking into these hallowed halls. So I think my view is, and this is something I'm hearing around the churches, how do we capitalize on some of the really kind of wonderful things that came out of the pandemic? And I, for one, had always wanted to do centering prayer at St. Barts, but I could never get away from the office early enough to be here at 5 or 5:30 and do that. So I did, with Manny, the online centering prayer, and it was just wonderful. And there were people in that group. It was kind of, the group would morph from week to week, but there were a lot of people who I'm sure were not members of St. Barts, and some of them, I'm sure, have become members of St. Barts, or at least regularly attending. So I think for all of us, thinking about all these different models and how people's lives have changed, and how do we kind of think about a kind of larger, more creative way of bringing, our job at the end of the day is to bring people to Jesus, right? So whether they're sitting in the pew or whether they're on their computer, if it's working, it's working.
Yeah, every Sunday at 11 a.m. we have 120 people watching online, in addition to whoever is in the chairs. And I would say, on average, every week we have someone come who says they started watching us online and this is their first time in person.
It's not threatening. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a lower barrier for entry.
Yeah.
Well, Mary Kate, unfortunately, we have to stop because we have to get ready for church.
Well, thank you for
so
asking
much.
Me to come.
Yeah, it's been great to have you here. And
well, I love the legacy we have at St. Barts. Alan, Dennis, and I. It's a great feeling.
A long history with the church pension
Exactly.
Fund. Thank you, Mary Kate.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being here. Hope you join us for worship at 11 a.m. and hope you're back next week. We'll be welcoming Miguel Escobar, who is the Executive Director of Episcopal Divinity School at Union, and he'll be talking about his new book, The Unjust Steward, on economic justice. See you then.